I want to keep today's lecture pretty brief because I think the PowerPoint lectures that I've done the last couple days are pretty long. And for Reconstruction, which is really the second half of the June 10th lecture here on the Civil War, I think you can get what you need out of the textbook, of course, and what I really want you to focus in on with Reconstruction is why it was necessary, how it succeeded, how it failed, and why ultimately it didn't succeed as much as it could have, or why it failed. Reconstruction, after war is always necessary, right? And that in many ways is the more difficult part of war. It's not the period in which the most suffering occurs necessarily, but it's a challenge to rebuild a nation after it's been destroyed by war. You've seen this in your own lifetimes, in wars, not here, but wars that the United States has been involved in. Nation building is a difficult process, and after the Civil War, there's no exception to that. It's not clear what should happen to these southern states. How should they be readmitted to the Union? The Constitution provides no guidance. The Founding Fathers didn't really deal with the question of what happens if a state wants to leave. Should they be brought back by force? If so, how do they get readmitted? And so Congress and the President, after Lincoln is assassinated, President Andrew Johnson, not to be confused with Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson takes over. And Andrew Johnson is a Southerner by birth, from Tennessee, one of those border states, and Lincoln had put him on the ticket in 1864 to try to create a sort of national unity government that would make for a smoother transition to peace in the aftermath of the Civil War. But Johnson was not supported by many in the Republican Party who control Congress at this point, and they wanted a more radical approach to reconstructing the South than what Johnson was willing to do. It should be said that Lincoln, before he died, had started a proposal for reconstructing the South that was pretty lenient. It put some restrictions on who could serve in political office, but it made for pretty easy readmittance into the Union for southern states. Johnson's plans basically followed Lincoln's, although he put restrictions on wealthy Southerners rejoining and taking political office, because he felt it was the wealthy planters in the South who had led the South into secession and led the nation into civil war. So he prohibited them from holding office, although he made frequent exceptions to his own rule. But the Republicans in Congress, led by the so-called radical Republicans, those who really wanted substantial reform of the South, wanted to go a lot further. They wanted to make sure that slavery was abolished, of course, but that all of the vestiges of slavery, the poverty of African Americans, the poor social and economic condition of African Americans would change. The stranglehold on power that the wealthy planter class had would be abolished. African Americans would get rights to land, to property. They would get rights to education, and so forth. All of these things were pushed for by radical Republicans in the Reconstruction period. During the war itself, of course, you had various promises made by various people. The Union General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, had issued a General Allotment Act in which it seemed like to African Americans in the South they were being promised 40 acres and a mule after the war, and that every African American freed slave would get some property as a result of this settlement. After the war, what happens is that in some areas in the South, African Americans get some property, either because they seize it themselves or because local Union commanders give it to them. In some cases, they buy it. They band together with other African Americans and they buy property from poor whites, whites who have been impoverished by the war itself, and they are able to buy the property sometimes very cheaply. But this doesn't last very long. And instead what happens is that Northerners, for the most part, want this land to be profitable. They want to resume the cotton production, and even if it's not done with slavery, it has to be done cheaply. And they don't want African Americans to own their own land. They want instead African Americans to continue to work the land, now as wage laborers, making very low wages, instead of as slaves. So there's a lot of conflict between what Northerners want, what Southern whites want, of course, and what the freedmen, as they're called, the freed slaves, want for themselves. Basically, what the freedmen want is fairly simple. They want property. They want to be independent. They don't want to have to rely on white landowners anymore. And even if they're free, they want to make sure that they're actually economically free as well as being legally free. And economic freedom means that they own their own land, they can farm their own land, and not be beholden to anyone else. Whereas for Northerners, freedom for African Americans in the South means that they're free now to sign a contract to work for a wage on a farm that's still owned by a white man or a white family. And for white Southerners, their interest basically is to try to return to normal conditions before the Civil War as much as possible. And they recognize, of course, that slavery now is gone, but there are things they can do to return to a system that's somewhat like slavery. And this is what happens in the South right after the Civil War. You have things like the Black Codes passed by Mississippi and other states that require African American men to sign work contracts by January 1st of 1866, and if they don't sign a contract, then they will be arrested and put in jail. Well, putting a deadline on when someone can sign a work contract basically means that you can force them to sign a deal that isn't very good for them. And this is, of course, the idea is that white plantation owners are going to force African American laborers to sign work contracts that will not pay them very much money at all, because the African Americans can't not sign it, because if they don't sign it, then they're just going to be hauled off to jail. So this isn't exactly slavery, but it basically perpetuates slavery in a different form. Congress in Washington, led by the radical Republicans, will act against these black codes and try to find new ways of ensuring the rights of the freedmen in the South. And this is why you see not just the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, and at the time Congress thought this was all that needed to be passed constitutionally. If you freed the slaves, then they were normal human beings like anybody else in America. But very quickly they learned that in the South, laws would not allow for that to be the case, and so they passed the 14th Amendment, which ensures that they have full citizenship rights, and that citizenship now, according to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, is not a state right that's conferred upon citizens, but now is a federal right. So there's national citizenship now as a result of the 14th Amendment, which is really important for all of us, as we'll see in the 20th century, when various states will take it upon themselves to curtail rights of free speech or rights to vote or things like that. It's the 14th Amendment that is used now to protect rights for all Americans across state lines. And then that, of course, is trampled on too, and there are all sorts of restrictions on voting put in place, especially, and so that leads to the 15th Amendment, which explicitly guarantees the right to vote to African American men, though not African American women. But even so, the South has tactics that are used throughout this post-Civil War period, mainly violence. And you see the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, of course, and other terrorist groups in the South that use violence, that kill people to intimidate the African American population more, in general, and encourage them to stay home on voting day. And it's not just African Americans, it's also any whites in the South who would vote for the Republican Party. They are under threat of violence as well, but the main target, of course, is African Americans. Congressional Reconstruction, and your textbook goes through all the details of this battle between Congress and President Johnson when it comes to Reconstruction. Who actually is going to control the process? Is it Congress or is it the president? And again, the Constitution, offers no guidance on this. But congressional Reconstruction, the more radical version of Reconstruction, is going to divide up the South into military districts overseen by military commanders. and basically not allow for self-government in the South until the reforms are adopted that the Congress in Washington thinks are necessary. Presidential Reconstruction by Andrew Johnson is, as I said before, more mild and not interested in this kind of radical reform of the South, but really just trying to get things back to normal as quickly as possible. One of the things that's set up by Congressional Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau. And General Oliver O. Howard runs the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau does all sorts of things, but is mainly known for setting up freedmen's schools across the South. And these are the first public schools of any kind in most of these southern areas. You don't have public schools in the South the way you do in the North in the pre-Civil War period, in the antebellum period. And now you have schools set up for freedmen, for freed slaves all across the South. And the teachers are mainly, initially, white missionaries coming from the North, but very quickly you have African Americans trained to teach school as well. And the Freedmen's Bureau also tries to help set up people economically, get them on a firmer footing so they can actually be free in the South. But the Freedmen's Bureau is not supported by the president. It's not supported by white Southerners. And eventually, this is one of the things that will, one of the government programs that will be killed off when Reconstruction is forced to come to an end. Like I said, I want to try to keep this really brief. So you need to read this chapter carefully if you haven't done so already to get the details of Reconstruction. But I want to jump ahead and try to keep this short. Reconstruction does a lot of good. It helps a lot of people transition from slavery to freedom. It is not wholly successful, of course, and that's because of white Southern resistance to it. And eventually, Northern whites lose interest as well. And by the time we get to the election of 1876 and the centennial anniversary of the United States, and people are focused now on the West, 1876 also sees the defeat of George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, defeated by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and the Sioux Indians. The focus is no longer on the Civil War, no longer on the South, no longer on freedmen in their plight. And part of the compromise that brings Rutherford B. Hayes into the presidency is a compromise that agrees to the end of Reconstruction in the South. And the Republican Party basically has shifted from the party of free soil and abolition, as it was when it was founded in the 1850s, to now being the party of business, the party of westward expansion, which it also was in the 1850s, but not as much. And that's the exclusive focus now of the party going forward. So as white America loses interest in Reconstruction, and white Northerners, and as white Southerners, of course, resist Reconstruction from the beginning, Reconstruction comes to an end, and the freedmen of the South are basically left to their own devices. They don't really control any institutions. There's only one Southern state during the Reconstruction period where they are able to have a majority in the state legislature, and that's South Carolina, where African Americans are the overwhelming majority of the population. And when Reconstruction comes to an end, very quickly you'll see voting rights curtailed, and by the 1880s, in most Southern states, it becomes nearly impossible for blacks to exercise their right to vote. It becomes nearly impossible for them to live independent economic existences either. And conditions for African Americans will deteriorate rapidly in the 1890s, which we'll come back to a little bit later next week. So I'll leave it at that for right now. And again, please read this carefully since I'm going over it very quickly in the lecture. There's nothing, though, that your textbook doesn't cover that I would want to cover, I don't think, with Reconstruction. It does a good job with this chapter.